Hi, this is Professor Drew. As promised, I'm going to go through the newspapers unit with a narrated PowerPoint here. Hopefully this will work out to make up for the class I missed. I'll try to do this in fairly bare bones. I'm not going to have a lot of bells and whistles on it, but since you're expected to know this material for the final, I do want to cover it, having a little bit more than just the PowerPoint, so I will talk us through it. Some of the questions I'm going to consider: how do newspapers emerge as a mass medium? How have the standards of journalism changed in the modern era? How do issues of ownership, economics, and technology bear on journalism? And what are some central concerns about journalism and democracy? When we think about news, we have to first think about why do we even need news in the first place. Some people don't even like the news. That's true of a lot of young people. TV networks and publishers are basically seeking a young audience, but a lot of young people are turned off to the news. People say that news is too negative. They find fault with the news as newsmakers. But people have always had news of some sort from the earliest tribal societies because basically we want to know what's going on around us out of just self-preservation concerns or for the sake of adding meaning to a larger meaning to our lives. So news has always been there. Something like newspapers goes back to ancient times, but news really has been especially central to the United States system of government because of its complement to democracy. People date the appearance of news in America to colonial times. By about 1765, there were 30 American newspapers, and these early newspapers had a particular audience. So I'd ask you to just think for a second, who were the earliest newspaper readers when you think about your reading? Well, of course, it was basically an elite audience. Uh, by by far the largest number were men, white men, well-heeled, rich. A newspaper could cost $10 to $12 at that time, which may not seem like much today, but that was a large chunk of people's salary at the time. Might be more than a week's salary for most skilled workers. And literacy was limited at that time among the lower classes. Still is limited, but much more so then. So newspapers only really address rich white men's interests at that time. This was true of both commercial and political papers. At that time, only enfranchised white men could vote, so that was the target audience of newspapers. Some of the key publishers of the earliest times were Benjamin Franklin, who published the Pennsylvania Gazette, and John Peter Zenger, who started the New York Weekly Journal. These newspapers tended to sometimes get in trouble with authorities, and so started the tradition that we know up until today of kind of an investigative journalism and of interrogating issues of power and things like that. There were both political and commercial papers. The political papers were often known as the partisan press, and as that term implies, they were affiliated with political parties. What we know today of objective journalism was unknown at that time in the 18th century. Newspapers were basically aligned with political parties. Often newspaper managers would actually receive patronage, which is to say bribes, from political parties. Political papers were often very short-lived. Sometimes they would often just crop up around election time. And as I said, they were fiercely partisan. They often accused the other party or the other party's candidate of terrible crimes. There was a lot of negative journalism and attack journalism at the time, which easily matched what we have today. There were also commercial papers at the time which carried basically shipping news, schedules of arriving ships and cargoes, things like that. They were basically aimed at businessmen. You could think of them as forerunners of today's Wall Street Journal. The real beginnings of the era of a modern press, and that date on the PowerPoint is wrong, it should be 1830s, is the penny press. The penny press started a new populist era of journalism. Papers were for the first time aimed at the common man. And this was spurred by new technologies. Steam-powered presses led to cheaper production and more output. And this shows again how technology drives change in media. We've talked about this repeatedly in class. Once they could print up to 4,000 papers an hour instead of 1,000 with these new steam-powered presses, they could sell them more cheaply. There was also an increase in literacy in the 19th century. And so publishers made more of an effort to appeal to the common classes, and so the penny press spread to urban centers. There were some key publishers of the penny press era, Benjamin Day in New York being one of them, and James Gordon Bennett also in New York. These penny press papers basically invented the concept of modern news. They would have local events, scandals, crime, things that the elite commercial press of the previous era would have thought was immoral, say a murder trial. Sometimes they had serialized stories, like the sort of stories that Charles Dickens or Mark Twain would have written. The penny press is in some ways the beginnings of what we think of today as sleaze journalism, of today's tabloid press, but it's also the beginning of a more objective model of the press that we see in today's prestige press. There was also celebrity news, believe it or not, in these early papers. The celebrities were different from today. They were frontiersmen like Davy Crockett or Daniel Boone, but nevertheless. How did they manage to sell papers, you may wonder, for just a penny apiece? Well, that's a key issue. And the answer, of course, is that they had a new business model. Instead of being patronized by political parties, they sold papers on the street for a cheap price and relied on advertising increasingly. So we see newspapers increasingly becoming independent of political parties, but at the same time, they're starting to become dependent on advertisers. And so you start to see a separation of reporting from opinion. You start to see a more objective model, not totally, but the beginnings of one. These papers were not by any means independent, as I said. There begins the uneasy relationship between news and advertising. These papers would advertise anything. They were often criticized for excessive advertising. They would advertise what was called patent medicine, which is basically snake oil. They would advertise all sorts of new packaged goods, department stores, all the things that were happening at the time, because this was coinciding with the rise of advertising and the mass marketing, which we'll talk about in class. Around this time also, a little bit after, was the rise of the wire services. We see wire services today like AP, United Press International, Reuters. These are basically started as consortiums, coalitions of different papers that had cooperative arrangements to share news, because papers are far-flung and they can't have correspondence all over the place. They just can't afford it. So they strike deals to share news with others who are better positioned to collect the news there. So deals with European publishers or West Coast papers. So the wire services spread access to faraway news and also serve to further objectivize the news, because they have to serve so many papers, these wire services, that they have to write in a more objective style. So we're seeing more and more the rise of objective news, but also, of course, that remains of sensationalism. We hear about, you probably learned about in middle school or high school, the rise of yellow journalism. The big era of yellow journalism was in the last decade of the 19th and the first decade of the 20th century. Yellow journalism was named for, strangely enough, a little cartoon figure called the Yellow Kid, who was one of the first popular cartoons and who was the subject of a kind of price war by two of the biggest publishers of the time, Joseph Pulitzer and William Randolph Hearst. But before we get into that, just think about what yellow journalism, the nature of it, how it looked. It was basically, again, kind of the beginning of tabloid journalism. In fact, the very same guy who was one of the big publishers of yellow journalism, William Randolph Hearst, eventually starts the National Enquirer, which we know even to today as one of the, supermarket tabloids. So it's definitely the beginning of that, of sensationalism and outright lying to sell papers. But there's also a lot of kind of serious investigative journalism and what's called muckraking in the yellow press. Muckraking is that idea of reporters going out, getting the story, and being willing to rake through the muck to find the real story. So you get guys like, you might have heard of these guys, Upton Sinclair, who investigated the meatpacking industry, Lincoln Steffens, Jacob Riis, who wrote about poverty and the slums and tenements of New York. So you get the beginnings of a model of journalism where people are really going out and investigating and trying to get the story behind the story. Pulitzer being one of the first big New York yellow journalism publishers. Grew up in St. Louis, started with some St. Louis papers, moved to New York, started the New York World. Sensational stories of crime and of sex side by side with serious crusades for housing, exposure of monopolies, exposure of trusts. He basically did a big exposés on Rockefeller Standard Oil Company, which we've heard about before, J.P. Morgan's banking syndicate. He basically laid the groundwork for Theodore Roosevelt to carry on his trust-busting campaign, his antitrust campaign. So this really appeals to a new readership that's kind of interested in these serious stories. It also Pulitzer made a great effort to appeal to female readers. This is a time when women are starting to become the main consumers of the house. So you get a lot of advice columns, you get a lot of fashion columns, etiquette, recipes, beauty, decorating, kind of like the living section of today's newspaper. Department stores are becoming major advertisers. Macy's in New York or Hudson's in Detroit. This is the era of the beginning of mass consumer culture. So papers are full of this stuff. They're also full of cartoons, big headlines, because they want to draw immigrant readers as well. There's a big wave of immigration to the country around the turn of the 19th, 20th century, and these publishers want to appeal to these new immigrant readers. The other key guy here is Hearst. Hearst was a guy who never let the facts get in the way of a good story. Very much tabloid-like journalism. He would have sensational, totally fabricated stories of things like the Loch Ness Monster or Sasquatch. And he also was famous, this is kind of a notorious episode of yellow journalism. He inflamed America's passions at the start of Spanish-American War. He basically helped to get America into the Spanish-American War, for better or worse. He famously concocted a story of women who were suspected of spying on American ships and were strip searched by Spanish troops. This was kind of what we would call an atrocity story today. There was really very little truth to it, but Hearst liked it because it got readers angry and made them keep reading. There's the famous story where Frederick Remington, an artist, was in Cuba. Cuba was the center of was the reason that the Spanish-American War started, and Remington, who worked for the paper, wrote back to Hearst and said, "Everything's calm here. There's not going to be any war." And Hearst said, "You furnish the pictures and I'll furnish the war." In other words, if we have to, we'll start a war. And there was the infamous coverage, which I would show if we had class, of the sinking of the battleship Maine by Hearst's New York Journal, which was very sensationalistic and really helped to inflame American sentiments and get us into that war. Hearst was also the model for Citizen Kane, which you probably heard, one of the greatest American films of all time. He really tried to get that movie suppressed. He didn't want to see it made. Orson Welles' great movie, but it was basically a thinly veiled biopic of William Randolph Hearst. Moving on, we're seeing two competing models emerge of journalism, the story model and the information model. Certainly, these models still exist today. Just the facts versus a story. Hearst always said he would prefer a novelty that's not a fact to a fact that's not a novelty. So we're seeing these models emerge. On the more fact side is the rise of objectivity journalism. This is really associated with the New York Times, which is still a widely read paper today, started by Adolph Ochs, or not started by him, but actually bought from somebody else and turned into a real prominent paper. A paper that really started by trying to distance itself from yellow journalism and focus on documentation of major events, appeal to a more affluent readership. And so New York Times really selling an objectivity model of journalism, which is beginning to really professionalize journalism. You know, there was a time when you didn't need a college degree, you didn't even need a high school degree necessarily to become a journalist. At the beginning of the 20th century, there are journalism schools beginning to open, and again, they're kind of professionalizing and creating a more objective model of journalism. We saw this even a little bit arising with the penny press, but it really comes to the fore late 19th, early 20th century. We talked in class in the context of public relations about the inverted pyramid style of writing, where you start with the who, what, when, where, why, and move on to the less significant details. This is becoming part of that objective, that professional style of journalism, is the inverted pyramid. Oh, there it is. The coverage of the sinking of the battleship Maine by the New York Times in a very, you can't see it here, but it's a very modest, even-handed, just a regular column on the side there, versus the New York Journal, Hearst Journal, which takes up the entire page and is offering rewards and is insisting. I should have mentioned, the ship blew up, and nobody's even today sure how it happened, but it was probably some internal fire that blew up the ship. Hearst started basically helped to start the rumor. There were politicians involved too, of course, that a Spanish warship had blown it up. So even as the objectivity model arises throughout the 20th century, starting around the 1960s, there's a real attack on the objectivity model, because this is a time when things like the civil rights movement, things like the Vietnam War are going on, and people are starting to say, hey, what has the objectivity model of journalism really gotten us? Basically, it's gotten a kowtowing to politicians. We need to be more advocates. We need to be more activists. So there are journalists who become more activists. There are also journalists who become more literary because they just find the objectivity model boring. The who, what, when, where, why is boring. So you've probably read some stories. They're easy to find today, which you would call journalism. It's a news story, but it reads a little bit more like not a fictional story, but just a little bit more evocative, a little bit more narratively interesting. That you can really trace back even to guys like Mark Twain. But in the 60s, a model of literary journalism or new journalism comes to the fore with guys like Truman Capote, Joan Didion, Norman Mailer, Hunter Thompson, and many others. Let's move along. Think about journalism and how it's changing in the TV and internet age. TV really challenges journalism because TV has its own journalism, of course, TV news. People are starting to watch TV news, starting to read newspapers in less numbers, and the newspapers are starting to say, hey, how can we adopt to shorter attention spans? Well, USA Today, even look at the kiosk. It even looks like a television set. It's in color. It was the first paper to have a lot of color. And in its very brief news stories and its bright graphics is really mimicking television news. And that goes right up until today with online journalism, which is constantly speeding up the news cycle and news getting more brief, more short, and more oriented toward the moment. Okay. Consensus versus conflict. It's interesting to think about papers today on the scene. You'll get some papers that carry just stories of local schools or community events. I mean, I was going to bring a paper to class that I picked up on a trip to the UP last year from Mucineing, or some little town like that in the UP, which is a great paper, but it just focuses on very local stuff. And it's really not, you're not going to see a lot of contentiousness or a lot of conflict in that paper. On the other hand, national and a lot of metro papers are still trying to focus on a conflict-oriented journalism. You may say, again, if you read this, you may say, oh, the news is too negative. Somebody's got to be negative. This is democracy, and people need to investigate the issues and look at the story behind the story that the government is telling and try to investigate that. And there are still papers that are more conflict-oriented that are doing that. There are also newspapers oriented today towards specific readerships. This has also always been, again, especially if you go back a century, different papers arising in the golden age of newspapers to accommodate different subcultures and different immigrant groups. So there were all these different presses, the African American press, the Spanish language press. You can still see those around, just as you see some Spanish language news broadcasting on TV. The Asian American press, the Native American press. Something else we might talk about briefly is the so-called alternative press. There's a little paper in Saginaw. It's not much of a paper, but it's called The Review. You could call that an alternative weekly. They come out once a week instead of once a day. They have stories that are a little bit more politically challenging and are not from so much of a mainstream point of view as the Saginaw News or the Bay City News or whatever. Well, big papers have a lot of these papers. Big cities have a lot of these papers. If you go down to Detroit and get a look at the Metro Times or just go to their website, they have a very very different approach to news, an alternative approach, a more liberal, a more politically activist approach than the mainstream Detroit papers. The Village Voice in New York was maybe the first of the big alternative papers, but you can find them in any big city now. There are a number of them in Chicago and all over. I wanted to talk briefly about newspaper operations. The news whole, that's the part of the paper that's actually devoted to news. It says in the book that's 35 to 50%. It's probably even less, honestly. Look at the Saginaw News, how much of it is advertising. There's just not a lot of remaining space to news because there's so much space that has to be devoted to advertising. But newsroom staff, publisher, owner, editors, reporters, different sorts of reporters. There are general assignment reporters who will report on any sort of topic. Sometimes big papers have specialty reporters to report on specific topics, or bureau reporters who are based in a particular city. A big newspaper like USA Today, or Wall Street Journal, or New York Times, Los Angeles Times, they could have papers all over the country. Reporters, bureau reporters all over the country, and a few all over the world. It's difficult to get work at big papers nowadays. It's difficult to get work at newspapers, period. I mean, I don't know. I don't think I've emphasized it enough, but newspaper business has been contracting, getting smaller for a long time because of TV and because of now, obviously, the internet. So it's difficult to get work, but there are those work positions, and I have seen some of my students, good students, get jobs in papers who were really driven to do so. Wire services and feature syndicates continue to go on, and some papers have syndicated columnists that, again, are syndicated so that they're in papers all over the country, even though they may be based, those columnists, in a particular city. As I said, there's been a circulation crisis in the newspaper business. A lot of people have just abandoned papers for TV or the internet. Readership has gone way down. Used to be 100 years ago, every household got one or two papers. Nowadays, obviously, that's not the case. There's less competition among papers in particular cities. Most cities are one newspaper towns, if even that. It's too bad because papers are one of the only remaining sources of local news. Again, what do we go to news for? To find out what's going on around us. And we need sources of local news, and that's something newspapers still provide. Newspaper chains, a lot of papers have joined big nationwide chains that have bought up a lot of newspapers, such as Gannett. Gannett's USA Today, which actually they just announced they're spinning off, but that's been sort of a model of the new newspaper with a lot of entertainment news, a little bit of investigative news, and not much local content. So a kind of decline in localism, a growth of big chains, has been the trend in newspapers for a long time. Newspapers are having trouble surviving because their main source of income, again, advertising and classified advertising, has dropped off so much. I mean, who wants to buy a classified ad in the local paper when you can just advertise on Craigslist for free and get your ad seen not only by a local audience but by people all over? So that's really hit newspapers hard, and they're starting to have to rely more on other means of support. Like Warren Buffett bought a bunch of newspapers a couple of years ago. Jeff Bezos just bought the Washington Post. These guys are not looking to make a lot of money. They already have a lot of money. They're sort of doing it from the goodness of their heart. So that's maybe a better model for the future of newspapers, to have these angels who help them out than to have to survive as a part of big chains or big companies that are on the stock market and have to show profits every year and that sort of thing, or every quarter or whatever. Going local, small and campus newspapers. Small papers are actually sometimes doing better because they have loyal readerships. Campus papers, things like that, they tend to practice consensus-oriented journalism, as I said before. And newspapers have really converged with the digital. We've talked so much about the digital, so you can go online and read the New York Times or read the Wall Street Journal, but how they're going to support those online is a continuing question. The Wall Street Journal has always had what's called a paywall, which means you have to pay to read the online version of the Wall Street Journal. You have to pay a lot. A lot of papers, including the Times and a bunch of others, gave away their content for free at first because they wanted to get eyeballs. They wanted to get people to look at them. The problem there is, when and how do you tell people, no, you can't have it for free anymore, you got to start paying? New York Times just put up a paywall a year or two ago, a couple of years ago. You can get a certain number of free articles, but beyond that you have to pay. It's like $30 a month or so. Well, no, that's the journal. I don't know. I subscribe to it. I don't even know what I paid, honestly, but it's worth it. A lot of people don't want to pay that because they can go and read news at the Huffington Post or whatever for free. But again, you get what you pay for, right? Rise of blogs. Blogs have kind of challenged traditional journalism because anybody could start one. Anybody could spout his or her opinions, things like that. That's the thing, is blogs are mostly opinion. We need people to go out and do the legwork and do the pounding of the pavement to actually find out stories and talk to real sources and things like that. And that's what newspapers have traditionally done that blogs don't generally do. There's your decline in newspaper circulation. And I would just emphasize, I guess, the vitality of newspapers for democracy. Journalism is a real vital profession, and yet it's one in danger of cutbacks, and a lot of reporters have been fired over the past few years, laid off because of the cuts in revenue, and it's just worth mulling over and considering what will be the future of news and how are we going to get that news that we need to function in a democracy. I don't have an answer, but something you should keep in mind. So that's my story, and that's the end of the newspaper unit. Hopefully this will be helpful to you. Bye-bye.